Make sure this is appropriately placed in a way that also doesn't block everything else. Trying to, sorry, make it not block the road.
There was an entire discussion about this, which we will have after our God is incapable of losing the game. I think it depends on how it's all working. Kevin, if God is outside,
All right.
is God inside of time, and therefore can he lose the game?
Okay.
God can't lose anything.
And I spilled tea while
Stick
doing
with
that.
that.
Okay. That should not spin. But yes, that is our...
I wouldn't call that losing if he wanted to.
All right, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Reasonable Faith. You've been introduced to our opening gavel now. But especially to everybody who's here online because it's cold, hello, thank you for joining us. Especially to folks from the physics department as well, welcome. Yeah.
Or Watermark Church, at least.
And Watermark, and possibly, okay, not the physics department. I was confused.
Well,
okay,
some
it's
of both,
a little bit
yeah.
of both. It's a mixed bag. Okay, well, tonight we're talking about this question of bad designs, which can be a significant objection against intelligent design. And Alan has studied this both at Biola and in his own personal study. He's pretty knowledgeable about it. I will let y'all know that we have rather tentatively set, excuse me as I confirm what we said, but sorry. Yeah, March the 8th as a night where we will have we'll watch a debate with William Lane Craig, who is going to be joining us virtually on the 22nd, if I remember correctly. So, which is also going to be a very interesting talk on the topic of the atonement. Dr. Craig, of course, very prestigious. So we'll just be watching a debate in preparation for that, and as a introduction to his philosophical style of defending the faith. So you can have that on your calendars, as well as the traditional pancakes and pontification event that will come the Saturday before that. So now that that's said, go ahead, Alan.
all right. Yeah, so, yeah, thanks to everyone for braving the weather to get here and all. And, yeah, we're in week 2 of a little mini-series that's more science-oriented. So last week, if you weren't here, we had Dr. Tim McGrew, also virtually, the only 2 of the semester, but talking about miracles. And he's a really great person on that topic. If you want to catch, we have that on our YouTube channel, Reasonable Faith UTD, if anybody's interested. But he wrote the Stanford Encyclopedia philosophy article on that and has published works on trying to show that Hume was wrong about it being impossible to rationally affirm a miracle and some things of that nature, and how that doesn't really conflict with science. And now the next few weeks, we're going to go into biology a little bit here this week, and then next week will be more of neuroscience. We're going to look at some evidence there that shows some interesting things that seem to point to an immaterial soul and things of that nature. And then the week after that, we have fine-tuning. Our own Seth Rippentrop is going to be speaking about that. So you physics people, we'd love to have you there to help interact with that evidence and share your thoughts on it. So anyway, let's jump in, though, today to the topic of so-called bad designs. And so we're going to look at issues of, from biology of, is it pointing to theism or naturalism from this kind of data? And so we'll start off a bit philosophically. We can kind of discuss it amongst everyone here and get some inputs on just kind of how would we go about evaluating some of this. And then we'll look at a few specific cases. Rather than covering a bunch of different ones shallowly, we're going to dive more deeply into especially human vision and looking at that, because there's been a lot of complaints about the retina is inverted and it's got these problems. You got a blind spot. Is that really a bad design? And that's an area where I have a little bit more expertise, having worked in image processing for a number of years, actually with Wayne Bailey some at one point. I think before you came, we actually had training where they spent a whole day and we're like talking about vision and human. It was really interesting that they were willing to devote that much effort, even just to.
Just the dumb UI guy.
No, you came in, and that actually ended up being successful after the company went bankrupt and reformed later. They actually.
I'm the only person I know that's been laid off twice from the same company.
There you go. Yeah. So anyway, yeah, we'll look at also vestigial organs briefly, panda's thumb, and we'll talk about junk DNA in a little bit more detail as well. And Jason, Dr. Slinker here may have a lot of insight into that aspect. So, and yeah, I mean, we're also going to speak a little bit about some of the things that seem like, well, this seems surprisingly optimal on a sort of naturalistic evolutionary paradigm. There's a little bit of that we'll get into as well. That would sort of be the converse of this. All right, so I guess the first question is, to what degree would bad design be sort of evidence for a naturalistic evolution in theory? So there is a long history within evolutionary biology where people will find sort of the ad hoc, sort of Rube Goldberg type things that they find in biology and say, this does not look like, I don't know why we actually had this replaced. They did pretty good about, that helped when I pushed that in. Hopefully that'll get better. Anyway, there are a number of sort of oddities that evolutionary biologists like to latch onto and say, look, there's no creator or designer. This looks like it was just rigged or something. So for example, Stephen Jay Gould, the famous Harvard paleontologist, I wonder if I should use a different cable. This is really bad, isn't it? We could try like rigging the chair maybe or something. If that just won't. I mean, I wasn't even touching anything, I don't think, the first time either. But so yeah, Gould has here's an example quote. He said, Darwin himself understood so well the primary proofs of evolution are oddities, imperfections that must record pathways of historical descent, such as the panda's thumb, one of the ones we're going to talk about. And there's a blog by an evolutionist of that name. Cornelius Hunter, he was a prof that I had in grad school that has written some books, and he sort of documented over time how evolutionists do often use this kind of argumentation. They sometimes use sort of theological arguments, which is almost, it's kind of non-scientific at that point. If you're trying to argue like God wouldn't have done it that way, you should be able to show, if you have a naturalistic evolutionary explanation for life, just focus on the empirical science and show, hey, here's this plausible way this could have happened. So he has some interesting works on that. And yeah, we read in that class that he taught, we read The Origin of Species, first edition, and we were like documenting all these ways in which Darwin really did try to argue on this basis as one of his main ways of arguing in that original famous work. So you see all these phrases like, it's inexplicable on the theory of creation. And he had certain suppositions about creation or how God would have done things based on this sort of Victorian English background. And I think too often, rather than questioning, well, do you know for sure that these expectations are right, there's this tendency to just sort of, assume that God would have to do things a certain way and then attack that. And that's the kind of thing I want to challenge, is scientists who are trying to make these kind of theological arguments. So what are y'all's thoughts? Is it appropriate to offer evidence for a scientific theory that depends on theological views in the science classroom, so to speak? What do you think, Rob? It depends on how you define theology, I guess, right? Yeah. Okay. I mean, I think where they're coming from, if I'm trying to defend them, I would say they're often speaking with people maybe that have some kind of church background and want to dismiss their evolutionary training. And so it may be natural for them to want to try to show, like, look, you may have these wrong assumptions. That might be the most charitable interpretation of that. I know myself, when I had a high school biology class, he was like bringing out the Bible and trying to sort of like bash the Bible and what it's saying and get you to think about this naturalistic version of evolution. Others have taken a better tack, maybe, of saying, well, let's be open. God could have guided evolution, theistic evolutionists or evolutionary creationists. They like to call themselves, I think, now sometimes. So, all right, what do you think about this question? Is bad design evidence against design? Any thoughts on that?
What is bad design?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, we find cases of bad design in the human world, like, say, this Hugo car. My sister-in-law won one of these cars many years ago, and it broke down within like a year. It was just so cheap. Yeah.
If not evidence against design, it does seem to be evidence against a perfect designer.
I agree. Yeah, there might be some challenges for one who would say that God designed it perfectly, or something like that.
I mean, wouldn't that thing be the same thing as like asking why are kids born with like mental deficiencies and stuff like that? That would be bad design. So I would say, I mean, I could see how someone would say, yeah.
Yeah, that is a challenge, right, to a Christian viewpoint. That's one of the hardest things, I think, is that sort of natural evil, the problem of evil. And yeah, that's tough. Usually we do have a talk once a year at least on the problem of evil, and that's a little beyond the scope here, but it sort of overlaps with this, doesn't it? So that's worth bringing up. But just in terms of like whether it's designed or not, I mean, even a torture rack from the Middle Ages or something, right? I mean, that's clearly designed, and so I don't think you could defeat design. It just points to the fact that you get into not just theology, but particular versions of theology to try to make an argument against design. So I think I agree with you, Rob. But so you're really tying, then you're going directly into certain things. And then you can also ask the question, though, of things like, well, what if God designed things at certain points in history, and then things sort of decayed? There was a certain level of entropy that set in over time. You could still have degradation in various ways and still have God being a designer. And if you're God and you're setting up biology, it's possible you might want to show that there are limits to these naturalistic evolutionary processes. I mean, that actually give you more evidential value that there had to be certain times of intervention, ironically. So I think when intelligent design proponents, they do try to present scientific arguments. I mean, you could argue whether this is science or philosophy. I'm not really that interested. I'm more interested in, like, is it true or not? Is there some evidence for intelligent design? But I think it's safer to start and kind of stay in the empirical domain and then use that information to unpack philosophical or theological implications sort of after the fact. But when you start really mixing them and going back and forth, and often a secular scientist is probably not trained in theology. It's not really what they're trafficking in, so it can get to be, I think, inappropriate at that level. All right, so we could also ask this question, which ties in with what Rob was mentioning, and then what I just said. Like, okay, bad design could be evidence against God on certain assumptions where you're assuming he sets up everything perfectly, he's totally involved every step of the way or whatever. But it might not be as clear if you're saying that it's also possible on certain design inferences or theories that God intervened at different points over time. For example, the Cambrian explosion is one of the sort of the well-known things where you go back 500 million years ago, most of the animal phyla seem to show up in sort of a geologic eye blink. And it's been difficult to come up with naturalistic theories that would show, well, how do you get so much innovation all at once? That could be an example where you could have a creator, designer intervening to sort of set up those body plans, and then maybe they evolve over time. There's a lot of possibilities. My own thoughts are that the Bible itself leaves open a number of possibilities. I think there's something very special going on with humans, but I think we all see that from just how distinctive humans are versus any other animal. So there's some kind of intervention going on there. And I'm open to kind of following the science wherever it leads beyond that. But so far in my own studies, it's like, having followed this for a number of years, there seems to be this overhyping of, we've got it all figured out. It's all just random mutation and natural selection, and then come up later and they have to make some admissions like, well, not really. We now know that alone wouldn't work. And I'm sort of just waiting to see evidence that would dismiss design more whole. I'm just not seeing it. Over time, we're going to show these bad designs that were seen as evidence against design are not really so bad after all, for example. So that's what we want to kind of look into here. So for example, this book, Genetic Entropy, by Dr. Sanford, Prophet Cornell. I don't know if he's retired now or not. This is a little bit older, but he's kind of arguing, that there is a lot of this sort of genetic entropy. Things are degrading over time at this point. And if you think about the different kinds of recessive diseases out there, it is very hard to eradicate those out of the human population, right? Because they only surface, if you've got both contributions coming in with the recessive trait, and it's just hard to fully get rid of things. They can build up over time as you have more genetic mistakes and you're not able to fully purge them. So, okay. There also, I think, are certain assumptions of bad design arguments that are sort of worth unpacking. You guys want to share any thoughts on what those are? Or we could just jump in, Robert.
Just that God would design it in an optimal way, something as close to perfect as we could imagine.
Right. So it's like people complain about, why do we have so many back problems or something? It's like, well, maybe we're just lazy, and maybe God doesn't want the totally easy life. I mean, everything in the Bible actually talks about how you will have tribulations. It's not really meant to be incredibly easy if you look at it. So yeah, that's a good one. Any other thoughts? Yeah, and sometimes it becomes sort of an argument from ignorance. We don't know what this DNA does that doesn't code for proteins, therefore we're going to call it junk. But as we learn more, we'll see that maybe that wasn't the best assumption. So yeah, I mean, in order to know, you kind of have to know the designer's intent. And it's also assuming God is the designer and is good. As a Christian, I would agree God is the designer. But I mean, that's part of what you're jumping directly into, a particular kind of theology and so forth. And then, yeah, this whole thing, would God have reasons for allowing imperfection or human hardship? Even in the Proverbs, it talks about how, like, the ostrich has this irresponsible way of dealing with eggs. And, there's some sort of examples of bad things in nature that seem almost intended, even in Scripture. So that's kind of interesting. And then what about the sort of evil supernatural forces? The Bible claims that there are demonic forces. These have a certain amount of power. Could they ever mess things up? It's at least something that has to be on the table if you're fully evaluating. And that's why it's like you are so far from the scientific empirical domain at that point. You got to be really careful. And so yeah, some of these arguments would fail if even one of these assumptions is false. All right, so let's talk about vestigial organs. So for example, Darwin, he thought the appendix was derived from something that performed a digestive function, and over time it just kind of decayed and lost that, and it was just still sitting around. These kind of things are reasonable expectations on an evolutionary paradigm, right? Where you just have these things happening, and things can easily, it's easier to break things than to make things. You could have things degrade. It's not an unreasonable assumption on sort of a naturalistic evolutionary paradigm or expectation. And by the vestigial, we mean that if they're evolutionary relics with little or no utility. More recently, there's been more attempts to try to sort of downplay, like, oh, it can have utility. It's just, if it's any kind of evolutionary relic at all, we're going to still call it vestigial. But the original, if you go back, 100 years, 150 years, or even like 70 years, you'll find more examples where they're just sort of claiming, yeah, these things are just totally useless. So the appendix is interesting. My wife had a burst appendix, and it was really bad. She came close to dying. So this one, I mean, is close to heart. It does seem like, in the United States at least, it can more often be bad than what we see evidence of being good. But there's been a number of studies that have come out now that have showed that actually the appendix has a utility, and it can be very important in certain situations. For example, if you're living in a third world country where there's a lot of infection, as a storehouse for good bacteria, the appendix is a way to allow you to sort of replenish the good bacteria. There's also been a growing understanding among scientists of the importance of all the different kinds of bacteria in your gut and different kinds of roles that those can be helpful with, actually. So it certainly has a use, and I think in the United States we have this more sanitary, good sources of drinking water and so forth, so it's far less useful. But interestingly, apparently it doesn't often have these kind of problems in some other cultures. You're less likely to have an appendix burst in other parts of the world where you don't have this over-sanitized kind of environment. My daughter, she went to med school some. She didn't end up becoming a doctor, but she now has 3 kids, and she's like, oh yeah, we need them to play in the dirt and get out there and be by the germs because it builds up your immune system better. And some of the things she learned in med school and so forth. So it's kind of interesting how that's come around. If you shelter people too much, it's actually not good for them. The other question, what do you guys think about this? Could vestigial organs be compatible with some versions of design theories?
I think so. I think that, with any creator, you would take a base model and then make things off that base model with
Yeah.
variations, So
Yeah. Yeah, I think so too. I think especially, if you have this view of the designer injecting information, helping things happen toward his purposes at discrete points in time, maybe they decay between that, and any different kinds of things could unfold. It's only if you assume like every possible thing has to be designed and optimized all the time by the designer, by the creator, that you're stuck with this sort of rigid mode of all or nothing. So yeah, I think vestigial organs could certainly fit in with some design theories. So yeah, I mean, if you go back, and I'll go through some of this fast so we can get to the other material, but it's pretty humorous actually looking at some of the older documentation of vestigial organs and the things they list. There's a lot of ductless organs in the human body that, like the parathyroid and so forth. The very important. My wife also had some issues with that one time where it was shocked after they removed her thyroid, and her face was fallen because she wasn't getting the calcium balance. And so these things are very important. And of course, yeah, you can live without tonsils and appendix, and usually, especially in our country, it's not a big deal. But it's not that we really don't have any undisputed claims today, I would say, of vestigial organs. So as a whole, this has not turned out to be a good argument for naturalistic design, I would argue. And some evolutionary biologists argue the same thing, even not operating from any kind of intelligent design framework, just saying it provides no special evidence for the theory of evolution, or that it cannot be defended as a scientific statement. So it really was sort of a bit of a gaps-based argument. Not that it wasn't, I don't blame them for evaluating it, because it does sort of fit with the predictions of a non-theistic version of evolution. And it's not like it's total, there's like nothing you could point to, but as a whole, I think this has gone the other direction compared to what they originally hoped in their arguments. So also, as Gould mentioned there, the panda's thumb is an example as well that's been complained, because it doesn't have an opposable thumb. It's just kind of a weird looking paw, right? And it doesn't seem very functional. It wouldn't be functional for the kinds of things that humans do, where we want to use our grip in various ways. But if you think about what does the panda really need it for, it's basically they eat a ton of bamboo, and they're really good at stripping bamboo and eating it fast, and they're able to use this paw as it is quite efficiently. There's been studies done that have shown that it's actually quite efficient for that purpose. So there's really nothing to complain about in terms of it being a bad design. Japanese study in Nature magazine said that it's well suited. It makes it one of the most extraordinary manipulation systems in mammalian evolution. So, I mean, they're operating from an evolutionary framework, of course, and they don't really see it as a so-called bad design or bad operation. I know a guy that actually asked Gould in his office one time, like, well, why do you think it's bad? Or he was trying to kind of probe. And Gould just said, well, just look at it. It is bad. It's not like he had really done a study. And so it is interesting that as you study more deeply some of these things, you see that, actually, there's really not much to complain about here in terms of the utility that panda actually needs. All right, so let's spend a while with more of a deep dive into vision. And we're going to look at the vertebrate eye. Richard Dawkins provides a good foil here for the complaint, which, I mean, I can kind of understand it. It's not totally ridiculous that he made this claim. Like, it is surprising. It looks a bit inelegant. He says, any engineer would naturally assume that the photocells would point toward the light, with their wires leading backward toward the brain. He would laugh at any suggestion that the photocells might point away from the light with their wires departing on the side nearest the light. Yes, this is exactly what happens in all vertebrate retinas. Each photocell is in effect wired backwards with its wire sticking out on the side nearest light. This means that the light has to pass through a forest of connecting wires, presumably suffering at least some attenuation and distortion. Yes?
Looking at that, animated diagram over on the right, from an engineering perspective, one reason I can think of why you went and have the cells that way is if they needed particularly strong access to the blood.
There you go. That's actually part of the explanation. See, you're a real engineer, so you are seeing seeing the core thing. We'll get to that in a minute. That's actually very insightful. Well done, Rob. All right, so I mean, one thing you might ask though is like, well, wait a minute, is it really that bad? I mean, we're talking about also the eye that the eagle has, which is renowned for its acuity at being able to see that mouse a mile away or so forth. Quite incredible. And then it's been long known that the eye has all these great features that it corrects for different kinds of aberration, both spherical and chromatic. And for refraction, it has some very special properties to minimize the effects of refraction. It even adjusts according to different frequencies. And then the fact that human eyes have been shown to, if you get in a dark room, let your pupils adjust enough and so forth, you can actually see a single photon. And so it spans the range at which you can see light. You have to be able to cover about 9 orders of magnitude from the dimmest to the brightest, which is pretty impressive, actually. So that's better than we do with our imaging satellites in the field that I've worked in for a number of years. Yeah, so the eagle. And that actually, there's been some articles out there that talk about how they're improving their digital camera design by copying different aspects of eyes. There's a whole field called biomimetics where they try to leverage lessons that you can learn from nature into engineering. And just the fact that they're able to do things, quite impressively sometimes in that field, it should at least get your attention. Yeah, some of these say things like it's borrowing one of nature's best designs. The other thing that human eyes are really good at, you really have sort of like an image stabilization system built in, and you're able to track things and predict. Because if you're hitting a baseball or you're playing tennis, that ball, from at least like a pro, it can go like a meter, and by the time it takes the nerves to transmit the signal. So there's a lot more going on in your retina. In fact, the retina is considered part of the brain. It's got this processing built in, and so there's a lot going on there that we take for granted. And then the fact that you get this unified field of vision from all these independent, disparate, detectors is also pretty impressive. But let's deal with the issue of that Dawkins raised of, okay, why do you have to go through all these cells, and you've got the detectors at the back of the eye and the retina there? Is it a kludge job, or is there some reasons why you would want this? So yeah, a big part of it is that the kinds of biochemical reactions that are going on in order to give you vision are actually ones that require basically the highest metabolism of anything. The brain is up there as well, but these are a little bit more higher metabolism than brain cells actually. And so you've got to have the blood source. Very important to have that very good direct connection to the blood. And then the reactions also produce these byproducts that have to be cleared out. And so you've got to replenish and sort of reset. You're making these detections, and then you have to reset it. If you look at something too bright, and then you can close your eyes and kind of still see your eyes. Sometimes in certain situations, your eyes haven't quite reset yet. And we sort of take for granted that process normally happens so fast you don't notice it. But the reason for that is because it's directly connected to the blood, and you're able to bring in this oxygen to feed the metabolic needs of these cells, and you're able to get rid of the byproducts of the vision. All right, so it really requires that direct connection. And this is not me saying it. This is like scientific studies. I've got some references in here that you can look up the scientific articles on this. It's not really controversial or anything. It's not just intelligent design advocates coming up with these articles. So yeah, so you have also some people saying that redesigning from first principles would end up recreating the vertebrate eye complete with an inverted retina. So some examples of those studies would be, there was 10 scientists in a German study in PNAS, Proceedings for the National Academy of Sciences, also one of the top journals. And they've discovered actually that some of those cells that are in this intermediate area, Mueller cells, actually are very important. They have some added features. They're ingeniously designed light collectors, according to this article, and they act as light filters, keeping images clear. They help keep the colors in focus. And so as you can see in this diagram, you get the different frequencies of light, red being the longest wavelength and blue sort of the shortest. And it's funneling them into the cones which detect the color, and trying to keep them in sync in terms of minimizing chromatic aberration, things like that. So it's actually accounting for the fact that you have a different amount of refraction going on based on the wavelength of light and things like that. And also these cells help prevent retinal damage. So there's actually advantages to having if there's these high-tech cells, having them in front of the photoreceptors does actually have an added benefit. So it even made the cover here, and they called it living optical fibers. And you can even see how it's channeling the light through those cells. So it's pretty cool high-tech stuff, actually. It's also been shown that they're using quantum confinement, that the width of these is only 10 nanometers, which is substantially less than red light by a factor of 30. Well, blue light would be the shortest wavelength, and I think that's like 300 and something nanometer for purple light. So yeah, it's like these are so small. How are they funneling that? Well, they're actually using quantum confinement. It's very efficient, and so it's actually really impressive system. So it's like there's this engineering elegance to it. There's also an article by some Israeli physicists who talked about the retina has developed its inverted shape to improve the directionality of the intercepted light beams, to enhance vision acuity, increased immunity to scatter and clutter, concentrate more light into the cones, and overcome chromatic aberration. Some of that overlaps with what we just talked about, but also just showing, yeah, there's another article there, and they list 5 different reasons for this. So it's far from a bad design at that point when they're using words like optimal and so forth, as they do in this quote here. So they admit it's seemingly illogical, but it actually turned out to be optimal, and it helps improve the sharpness. So this often a rejoinder to this, people will say, well, look at the invertebrates, for example, cephalopods, squids, octopuses, things like that. They don't have an inverted retina. They have the photocells kind of directly in front there. But what differs about their visual needs relative to most vertebrates? Any thoughts on these creatures living in the ocean, different environment? How might that affect things?
Quite often the focus for several invertebrate eyes is an emphasis on motion rather than position. So perhaps there's a little bit of a benefit of just being able to sense light changing, not necessarily where it is changing.
Yeah, that's definitely a difference. Have some relevance. Yeah.
You're also operating under less total light, not on the surface.
Yeah. So yeah, think about what Rob, what are your thoughts? Go ahead before I say anything.
As I understand it, certain frequencies of light don't make it all the way to the bottom of the ocean.
Right.
Like at a certain depth, blood stops appearing red.
Yeah, when I was getting my advanced scuba certification, we take a color chart down to like 100 feet, and you're trying to analyze how it changes, and yeah, you lose the red totally, yeah, by the time you get down to that kind of a depth. So these creatures are actually, yeah, they're monochrome, they don't have color vision, and there's far less light. So some of the reasons that the vertebrate eyes need more replenishing is because you have more light. You also have more UV light to filter out and things like that. And so if you think about those different conditions, you can see why, well, yeah, for them it's probably more optimal to not be inverted, actually. I mean, the other thing, yeah, just the amount of light. When we dive and we're going on night dives, that's when we see the octopuses active. They're nocturnal hunters, basically. So, I mean, there's not a lot of light at night down, 20 feet or whatever even. So it's a whole different environment for them. It's also a cooler environment. You don't need to dissipate energy as much in this kind of marine environment. So totally different requirements. So yeah, it's not like you can say, oh, well, they got, this is the best design in all situations. All right. So yeah, as I mentioned, the retina is part of the brain. There's a lot of image processing going on that this is why you have optical illusions, right? Because your brain is filling in things and doing things as you're interpreting vision. And that's why you end up having like illusions and so forth. You're doing edge enhancement. There's some signal compression, noise reduction aspects. We've already talked about the extrapolation of moving objects and image stabilization. There's obviously the 3D aspect from seeing left and right, but your brain is integrating that together and sort of building a 3D map, if you will, of that. So just showing one, if we had more time, we could show several of these interesting optical illusions, but which is darker, A or B? That's right. If I was setting this up, I probably would have made B darker, and it would still look lighter and be even more impressive. But yeah, they're actually the same because you're building in this expectation. You're kind of factoring in your shadow detection aspects and your 3D model, and so this is just designed to throw you off, though, right? You don't normally see many optical illusions in the real world. It's only these specially designed ones where it's trying to trick you, where it really comes into play. So did the eye evolve? I mean, it's an interesting case because many of the evolutionists that want to promote a naturalistic version of evolution would argue that this is one of the better examples because there is a wide variety of eyes out there. And, plausibly, it could be, that's something that could weigh in their favor potentially if you can show that these you've got some things that have this very primitive eye, so to speak. Other organisms add on certain things. There is such a wide variety. It does have the potential to be a good argument for evolution. Okay, and so, there also, though, is challenges. Isaac Newton was very impressed with the optics of the eye, this great pioneer in physics, and also who was a theist. And Darwin admitted in Origin of the Species that the eye, with all its inimitable contrivances for adjusting the focus and all these corrections for aberration and so forth, he says it does seem improbable that natural selection could account for it. But then he goes on after that to try to say, but maybe it could, and here's some reasons. So it's an interesting one to think about in terms of the evolutionary aspect. I just had to throw this in here as a reminder. The last thing a fly ever sees, its compound eye, looking at the fly swatter coming in. So there are a number of different eyes out there. And so there's the potential, you could maybe argue these incremental changes, but there are some challenges to that narrative. Is there really a plausible gradualistic pathway between these? And then the other problem that even Richard Dawkins admits, this famous atheistic evolutionist, he says the eyes evolved at least 40 times independently around the animal kingdom. So they've had trouble coming up with the evolutionary tree that would show that, oh, you really are always reusing this. It seems to show up in ways that require a new origin of vision. Yes? Yeah. Yeah, this could be this sort of convergent evolution notion has some, it's a possible explanation that could fit with the naturalistic version. Where it comes into problems, I think, though, is like when you look at the sonar system of the bat and the dolphin, and we know their last common ancestor certainly didn't have that. And then they look at the genes and they're like, it's using at the biochemical level like these identical mechanisms. So while it might plausibly have some convergent evolutionary explanation for just the principle of some kind of sonar kind of system, if you look at the details, sometimes it's hard to envision why would it just happen to be so exact in the details. So it's sort of a mixed bag. But yeah, the only point I'm making here is that there's been so many origins, and that's what I would want to focus on, actually, is that initial vision system somewhat. But Jonathan McClatchy, a PhD evolutionist who's an ID advocate, he points out that, yeah, they're all using the same underlying mechanism of rhodopsin across all these cases. So it's kind of interesting. It's possible that it's a convergent evolutionary thing, but how does it land on the same molecule? Is it really that readily available in all these different environments? Can you really make this? It's really a suite of proteins that you need too. And so it's interesting that it's using some of the same exact proteins in all these different environments. The other challenge that you have is that some of the oldest eyes are actually not that primitive, that we'll talk about in a minute. And then there are some challenges, for example, to evolving a lens. It might look in principle like, oh, this little, you just have this light-sensitive cell, and then you add a lens, and then it gets a little bit better. It sounds plausible, but when you start thinking about what's actually going on in your lens development, there are some. Here's a slide from Dr. Brian Miller, who's a PhD physicist who studied this and has an interesting talk. He also is an intelligent design advocate, full disclosure. But I recommend highly his YouTube video on this that's listed on the top there. And I can make these slides available to anyone. But he goes through a number of things I didn't have time to get, of just like the amazing aspects of the vertebrate eye. But he points out that you need all these kind of transcription factors. You need all this complexity to develop a lens, and what is actually happening when your eye is developing is that you have these cells that eject the nucleus and all the organelles, and then they harden into these lenses. And so you have to have a lot, and you still need like pathways to nourish them and so forth. So there's a lot that seems to happen at once before you can actually even form a lens. It's not to say it's impossible, but these are some of the challenges to the evolutionary narrative. At a minimum, I think you could say, like, maybe God did use evolution, but if he did, he set up this amazing system, right, that would allow you to do all these things. But I mean, I'm kind of more skeptical of the evolutionary paradigm at least fully explaining all these things without God intervening at certain points in time. But I'm open to follow the evidence. Anyway, I definitely highly recommend this talk by Dr. Miller. See how we're doing on time here. So yeah, with respect to some of the older eyes that we see out there, so if we go all the way back to the Cambrian, pre-Cambrian, you just had some really primitive, very simplistic cells. You didn't have all these different animal phyla at all. And so it is interesting that some of the earliest eyes that we have any fossil evidence for are quite complicated. You have versions, for example, this, I won't even try to pronounce the name of this creature, but 16,000 lenses in each eye. It's more than a lot of the modern day things. The housefly has 3,200. It's thought to have great vision, but there was also some aspects for how that worked that were also quite impressive. All right, so the other thing that scientists have documented in some of these articles is that the compound's eyes, the way that those grow has been consistent for like 500 million years. So there's not a long incremental gradualistic evolutionary pathway for how that's happening. One physicist said it's an all-time feat of function optimization, going way back to when we basically first saw eyes within, the 20 million year or so granularity that you could even age things going back that far. But actually, the Michael Behe, he's an intelligent design advocate who wrote Darwin's Black Box, among other seminal works. He's documented how in order to get a cell to become sensitive to light, the very thing they take for granted as a starting place is actually incredibly complicated. And this also relates to if you've got this showing up 40 times independently from non-seeing organisms, it's rather surprising that you're coming up with something this amazing. So, and this is really, I'm just going to share a subset of the different things going on. But one of the interesting things is that the photon, it's hitting the retina and interacting with a molecule called 11-cis-retinol, and it changes the shape in 20 femtoseconds, which is basically the time it takes light to travel the width of a human hair. So there's this very rapid reaction, which is impressive. And then you have a cascade of things. That's where you need to interact with the protein rhodopsin, and you're changing the retinal shape to force changes in this protein shape that then allows it to bind to other things, and it starts this whole cascade of different interactions. And all of this is just to send nerve signals. You still have to have the sort of the brain framework to interpret it, right? So before it's useful, it's not enough just to send some nerve signal that the organism is not set up to understand. That you kind of have to have several things right at once in order to first get this vision. So again, it seems to resist a gradualistic evolutionary pathway. I'm not going to go through all these technical details. So yeah, now the part of the presentation that talks about the other surprising thing is the number of very optimized things that you find in biology. This is Professor Bialek from Princeton. He's a physics professor who's specialized in the biological aspects, and he's got a number of papers and public lectures you can find at the popular level online, which are quite interesting. And he's pointed out some optimal aspects. So even the protein rhodopsin has about 350 different amino acids. And it's been shown by Robert Sauer at MIT, Doug Axe from Caltech working at Oxford, and others have kind of shown that generally most sequences of amino acids don't lead to functional proteins. In order to just have a stable structure even, it's fairly rare among possibilities. So it makes it difficult. I'm not saying impossible, but it's one of the challenges to just saying, oh, well, we have all these new proteins, and just kind of taking for granted that that's an easy thing. It's actually very difficult when you keep in mind that natural selection is just preserving what's good. It's not innovating anything. You've got to do sort of more of a random search in order to find new proteins or protein folds. So there's a number of challenges with that. How do you get optimization in a world in which, from an evolutionary standpoint, if you view those as sort of fitness peaks, yes, natural selection can help drive you towards a peak. If you have, and there are some cases where you have small gradual changes, and it could evolve and lead you to some fitness advantage. But if these peaks are really separated like this, which from what we know, I think they often are, it's very difficult to find a global optimum among those peaks, because you're not going to be able to cross the peak if you require 20 mutations of just a particular version in the genetic code. That's too improbable to happen by chance all at once, as has now been shown by empirical testing. So Bialek says, while it's popular to view biological mechanisms as a historical record of evolutionary and developmental compromises, these observations on functional performance point toward a very different view of life, as having selected a set of near optimal mechanisms for most crucial tasks. So we have some evidence that's sort of the opposite of bad designs. It's like, how does this originate on this kind of naturalistic, at least, evolutionary paradigm? And so he documents some things like E. coli bacteria closing in on a food source, where they've analyzed it in detail and shown that it's basically about as good as could be physically possible. You also can look at sharks and how they're able to measure these incredibly subtle voltage differences in water and so forth. So he's documented a whole number of these kind of optimizations. System in some cases couldn't get faster, more sensitive, more efficient without first relocating to an alternate universe with alternate physical constants, is what Bialek has documented. So that I find that interesting, at least. It's a challenge. You also find these really crazy things in the scientific literature where it talks about, for example, amoebas finding approximate solutions to NP-hard problems like the traveling salesman. And you can actually use that in computing, or that you find green sulfur bacteria using quantum computing for light harvesting and so forth. It's like, wow, these sound pretty high tech for low life to be coming up with through random naturalistic processes. Bacteria know how to exploit quantum mechanics, study finds. Now, of course, they're not saying, they're purposeful. They assume they lucked into it through evolution, but it's very difficult to, as we know from trying to build quantum computers, right? It's very difficult to avoid, keep it in this superposition state and so forth. So it's interesting that some of this low life has been able to solve those problems somehow. And we don't have a lot of time, but just to briefly mention junk DNA, because this was an area that was really hammered home by those who would try to argue that, we've just got this strong evidence of this kind of very poor design going on. It's been known for a long time that humans, there's only about 2% of our DNA that codes for proteins. And so there was an assumption among some that a lot of the remainder is sort of just junk, just things that are not constrained at all by evolution and just sort of randomly changing and so forth. And that people use that as an argument against intelligent design for a long time. Meanwhile, you have some intelligent design advocates on record going back many decades ago saying, hey, we think there could be some function to this. And again, as we discussed earlier, you could accommodate some level of junk DNA within a design framework, no problem. But the prediction was that, it's probably not going to be this high level of junk that these evolutionists are claiming. And so, there's been a trend over time toward discovering functionality for this other part, which is really not that surprising when you think about it. Because if you think about the complexity of building any life form and growing over time, it's obviously a lot more than just, here's what the proteins you need to build. You're going to have to do it in certain orders. You're going to have to, you've got the same DNA in all the cells of your body, but you don't want those digestive enzymes. You don't want the genes expressed in your brain, right? You've got to make sure you control where genes are expressed within all the different cell types. And that's non-trivial. That's also why it's hard to evolve new functionality, because even if you come up with a new protein that's awesome at digesting, you better make sure that it's expressed in the right place at the right time or it's counterproductive. But getting back to junk DNA here, so there's now literally, I think, at least a couple thousand or more scientific articles pointing to some of the functionality that they've discovered in virtually every kind of the DNA sequence. Some of it, you have these long interspersed nuclear elements, so-called lines. Some of it probably is the case that the sequence doesn't matter, but the number of DNA codons does matter because it positions the DNA in a certain position in this wrapped chromosome and things like that. And you have, that plays a role then on being able to access that part of the DNA for certain things. There's actually different levels of code even within DNA where you can code for the histones, for example, and the RNA splicing. So as just a quick review, especially for those of you that maybe haven't had a lot of biology, you have DNA that gets transcribed into RNA that then gets translated to build proteins through these ribosome, amazing molecular machines that will then convert that into a sequence of amino acids and put them together in a form that then they can fold. Sometimes you need these other chaperonin proteins to help them get the right shape, but the exact shape is usually very important if it has some kind of enzymatic function. To speed up reaction, it's got to bring together molecules of a particular type to speed up a reaction, which if you don't have enzymes in life, it just doesn't work. You've got so many of these key reactions that you have to speed up. So the point is there's all this part of the DNA. They didn't know what it did, and they've gradually been discovering more purpose. In particular, skipping on for sake of time, this ENCODE project in 2012, and there was a follow-on later, was very seminal in showing that actually most of that DNA is transcribed into RNA, at least about 80% of it. And they admitted, too, that they're not studying all possible functions at all possible times in an organism. So some of them might just have a developmental, like while it's an embryo, you need this part of your DNA, but you don't use it later. There's a number of things like that. By contrast, some evolutionists have argued, well, just because it's expressed into RNA doesn't necessarily mean it's useful. This could be junk RNA. And then they've shown that really that has a lot of purposes. And now some people even say you have junk proteins. But I think that's far less plausible because junk proteins can cause all kinds of problems with interacting with other things within the cell. So the ENCODE project, in particular, it's interesting because you'll see some evolutionists really, they didn't like the ENCODE project. They really argued against it and said, this can't be right. If one guy from Houston even said, if this is right, then evolution is wrong. It was just really crazy. But yeah, most of them weren't quite to that dichotomy there. I don't think that's right. But yeah, there's been a number. If you Google it, you can find all kinds of articles yourself rather easily on showing how so-called junk DNA was really a misnomer, and that these parts of the DNA that didn't code for proteins do have other purposes. We don't always know what it is. Maybe some of it is junk that fits within the design paradigm as well, but the majority of it seems to have very positive functions, and a lot of it relates to building proteins in the right cell types and things like that by causing the RNA to be expressed right or the DNA to be wrapped correctly into the right positioning, things like that. So you'll see a lot of articles about junk no more, no longer useless. Here's a bunch of important roles. And I think this is a good summary from one of the articles just showing the Human Genome Project was back here. They finally figured out how most of the human genome mapped to protein forming. And then you have all these others. We're still on this, this steep curve here, exponential curve for finding more uses for the non-protein coding part of the DNA. Was there a question in the back? Okay. So yeah, is there any, this is a good time maybe to, I think, wrap it up and give a couple minutes here for any comments or discussion about any of this that you guys want to. And if not, we can always bail out early before it gets too cold and icy out there. Yeah. Yeah.
And things that he specifically pointed out as evidence for theistic evolution, I guess intelligent design, there are now going to be some reasons to reconsider were junk DNA and the design of the eye.
Yes, he himself has backed off. He's admitted the junk DNA claim was not quite right. So yeah, he is a theistic evolutionist and sort of anti-intelligent design. But I mean, he had a strong conversion from a secular background to Christianity and was willing to stand up in the public place for that, which is good. He's become a bit of a controversial figure in some circles, but.
What do you mean when you say a theistic evolutionist?
So someone that believes in God and believes in evolution as being a fairly comprehensive explanation for biological origins and development, but recognize, and actually there's a wide variety though of people that might be called theistic evolutionists in terms of, some would want to say, I think Collins is more on this extreme, that there's not necessarily any evidence that God intervened at different points in time, but he still views God as like the ultimate one that created everything. And I think he finds the fine-tuning argument to be a strong one from science. But he doesn't really think that you can detect God's intervention in nature in the evolutionary world. But there are other ones who are theistic evolutionists who would say, yeah, I think God guided the evolutionary process and interjected at different points in time, things like that. So there's kind of a wide variety. Yeah. Seth, since you haven't.
I would just like to add a third kind of model theistic evolution that I've heard of. I'm not necessarily a theistic evolutionist, but I've
Yeah.
heard an idea of kind of going off the fine-tuning, like an extreme version of fine-tuning. This idea of like, this theistic evolution would evolution and
Right.
or natural a natural random. It's not necessarily
Yeah.
good, but a random evolution that like the physical constants of the universe and the physics of the universe has been fine-tuned to such a degree that if you were to rewind the clock back and run evolution again, it would just produce humans again or something very close. And that, like, within the nature of the universe, evolution in the way it played out here on Earth was just kind of already encoded to happen.
That would be someone like Simon Conway Morris might be that way. He's a UK evolutionary biologist who is a theist, and he writes a lot about convergent evolution.
Yes.
Yeah.
Convergent evolution
Is very big, and he calls it the ghost of teleology, of seeing purpose in nature. So yeah, that would be more of the view that it's all put in at the beginning, but it was so purposeful and well designed that God knew what would happen. There are other theistic evolutionists that almost make it seem like God is surprised, or they would be more like open theist types of just saying not even God knew what would happen or something, which seems really bizarre to me. But Rob, you had a question or comment as well?
In order to bring about his goals, God set up a system, evolution, and set up, I guess, what we would describe as random chance. Set up the universe and its seemingly random events such that humanity would arise.
Yeah, we've talked some about Molinism, that God has this middle knowledge. On a view like that, you could envision even that God could, he could consider all possible worlds and instantiate the one that would bring about his purposes without having to directly intervene necessarily. So there's a lot, when you really meditate and think about God and all the ways in which he could accomplish something as this sort of omnipotent being, there's a lot of options, and that's why I think we need to be open-minded about it and so forth. Yeah, I mean, you could choose what cards are going to be dealt without having to intervene by instantiating the right world among possibilities, even, for example. Yes?
That would be, you would have to also include the other powers that be. There's other powers.
Yeah.
If you talk about theism, there's other powers out there other than God. But my question would be, Neanderthals, wouldn't that help, like, evolution? Like,
well, it depends on, there's different views of Neanderthals. Some would say these are just they're so similar to modern humans, their brain was probably at least as big, but maybe it's just another species of human created by God. Maybe it evolved, maybe it didn't, but it doesn't necessarily pose any problem, I think, to a Christian viewpoint necessarily. Yeah, the timing aspect certainly would. Yeah.
I'll say that we had a lecture from Dr. Casey Miskin last semester, and his essential contention was that it's actually, there's large differences between hominids that are closer to apes and hominids that are closer to humans. And so you can kind of associate Neanderthals, for example, or Homo erectus, with humans in ways that assign them actually a lot of intelligence, whereas you have like the Lucy skeleton that had, from what we can actually determine about it, which is very little, structures that were a lot more ape-like than human-like, and there's actually a distinction that can be drawn.
Lucy's not a Neanderthal.
Yeah.
But
it's so primitive, though. I think, yeah, the point is that there's not this great sequence of intermediaries that are like, fine graduations.
Something like Darwin's drawings, all of a sudden, it's like, oh, that exists, right? No, those were drawings.
Yeah.
So you have all of those pieces.
Yeah, there's an interpretive element. And yeah, you find other evolutionists kind of pushing back sometimes on the Lucy reconstructions or the things that were done to try to make it seem more like this great intermediate step when really it might have been more wishful thinking. But I mean, the whole fact that it could be something that bothers some Christians, that you just have these, you do have a number of these different near human-like creatures, and it does raise some questions.
was that Adam and Eve? You know what I mean?
Yeah, there's different theories about that,
You
and William Lane Craig has sort of a controversial theory. Yeah, so I think when you look carefully at the Genesis account, and we've talked about that some in here as well, it doesn't, it's not a science textbook, and people too often try to read more into it or think that it's trying to answer the questions that we as modern people wanted to answer, and it's not always really trying to answer that question. And so we need to be humble about what we think it's trying to necessarily say. And yeah, a good source on that would be C. John Collins, who is the Old Testament editor of the ESV translation, so a very conservative evangelical scholar, but he argues that Genesis is not teaching an age, and he has a number of books. He's a Hebrew expert, and he has a number of books on Genesis interpretation that are pretty interesting. And so he makes some of the same points. He has a couple degrees from MIT as well, so he's knowledgeable on some science and engineering aspects. Yeah?
So in that respect of trying not to add on to what Genesis is saying, with regards to however some sort of evolutionary process or intelligent design process took place, what would you say is the thing we can confidently say that Genesis says about human uniqueness? Does it rule out any sort of common descent from hominid sort of thing in Genesis, or how would you say Genesis makes the clear division between human and all the rest of it?
That's a great question, and I'm sure there's different views within this room on that. I think my view.
My question. I asked the same question.
Okay, yeah. Okay, that's what you're getting at with Neanderthals.
Yeah,
okay.
exactly, yeah.
I mean, it does seem like there's some kind of pretty strong intervention there. I mean, maybe it's a somewhat metaphorical, the way he's making Adam and Eve from the dirt in the ground, but there's something very significant going on. But I'm somewhat sympathetic to those theistic evolutionists, though, that would say, well, maybe God did something special and put this human soul into this creature. But I tend to be more towards this is an intelligent designed creature, that God did, that it doesn't necessarily have to tie into any evolution. But I don't rule it out. I don't know that I could rule it out from Genesis either. I'm open to it. But I don't see the strong scientific case that bothers me any, that it has to be that way either. So that's a great question.
Neanderthal, I don't know, man.
I mean, there's no evidence that humans descended from Neanderthals or anything. There's evidence maybe that there was some crossbreeding going on, which is interesting, which also would point then to maybe it was just another species at the time. But I don't think there's any kind of plausible evolutionary account for humans, even though there's these kind of hominid-like creatures out there. There does seem to be this big gap, and we're just so much beyond apes, chimps, and other things. It doesn't seem to me that, it seems to be very compatible with this notion that God did some kind of special creation of Adam and Eve, and all humans came from that. But there's different views among even, evangelical Christians on that. Yeah.
Can you comment? This isn't something I've studied a whole lot, so I don't have the processor this group of folks does. But I do remember something that resonated with me, which there could be something about when Earth was actually created, where in Genesis 1 it says the Earth was without form and void. And then it goes into, and so I've heard some people say, yeah, you could say God created it, there was some form of life going on, it was destroyed, and what we see as the beginning of the story is there's kind of the gap theory or whatever, for lack of a better term. Do you have commentary on that or thoughts?
I do think that Genesis 1:1, Collins makes this point, I think, pretty strongly, that Genesis 1:1 is not a summary statement of what's about to happen. It's more of a statement of what happened before the rest of Genesis. And he points to the Hebrew idiomatic things, other examples in the Pentateuch to make that point, which is interesting. So that alone, I think, opens up the possibility of at least an older universe. You also have people even like John Piper saying, well, he kind of says he leans towards John Sailhamer's view that it may be more focused on the promised land in the Genesis account and not necessarily trying to give you this complete picture of the creation of everything. But there's a lot of different views.
One sentence on that. You're kind of interesting. You're saying more.
It's written by Moses to the people as they're, going into the promised land, and he's giving them more context and background. So some people, I don't necessarily hold that view, but that's another theory that would focus on it, referring more to that kind of setup and not necessarily trying to explain creation from nothing every step of the way within the Genesis account.
So the earlier question about what makes humans distinctive in the biblical record, like the thing that pops up most or rises to the front for me is that made in the image of God. And
Absolutely.
Like that's I don't even know that, there's probably thesis papers and people who know the original language that could talk to that a lot better, and what that meant in antiquity time.
Yeah, and the humans are given dominion over all the other creatures. So yeah, I think that's exactly it, and that's so distinctive and so different.
Define human. That's what I'm saying. Like.
Okay.
Define
Yeah.
human.
Like, does it include Neanderthals or?
Does it or doesn't it? You don't know.
I could see that it could, but I don't know, and we're running out of time, thankfully. Seth, one quick comment or question, and then we'll close it out.
Okay, I was just going to say on the whole Genesis thing, there's also the idea that at least in the first few verses, that the Hebrew word bara there didn't, it usually translated as created or, to create. It could also mean like to give a purpose to or like bring to form or something like that.
Right.
Instead of saying the actual creation, it's more God giving a purpose to everything and putting everything in this certain order and, infusing his plan and everything. And that's probably what the Israelites were like more so interested in getting out of that creation.
Right.
Is God bringing order and purpose to everything.
Someone like John Walton at Wheaton emphasizes that aspect a lot, which again, I don't fully agree with that, but I think you're right by bringing that up, as that's part of what's going on. Walton would take it as like almost the only thing going on, but yeah. But we definitely are out of time at this point. So thanks everybody for your attention and coming out.
Well, some of us might, an emphasis on might, because it feels like 15 degrees right now.
Wow.
Go to the Taco Bell and continue some of this conversation that's over there by Synergy. Yes, definitely inside. I was actually introduced this week to, I should probably stop this.